mine. My own mutual is great. Insurance, investments, just in the banking. My own mutual is great. USSD, WhatsApp, okay, Konapo. My own mutual is great. Insurance, investments, just in the banking. My own mutual is great. USSD, WhatsApp, okay, Konapo. My own mutual is great.
Wabakukwanisa kuwa na services Old Mutual anasanganisira insurance, investment, net banking all on one platform. Usebenzisa password eyoto. WhatsApp le USSD. Chaya usta 227 hash. Bombe ukutumela WhatsApp ku 0777 227 227. Ukuthi wenze konke ku my Old Mutual.
Insurance, investment, savings, net banking. My own mutual is great. USSD, WhatsApp, okay, Konapo.
Hello. And here we are at the end of another week, talking nonsense over a drink, trying to solve the world's problems. Once again, if you think we know what we're talking about, you should probably have a drink yourself, have a nap. Maybe when you get up, the world will be right side up again. It's been a very chilly week. A lot has happened in the news. This evening, we're going to try and get through as much of that as possible, and see how it affects our worlds and what these three gentlemen think about it. But before we get to that, gentlemen, what are we having this evening?
What's going on over there? This is quite a lot.
It's actually quite. But, well, and you're dressed like a normal person today.
Really, George?
Anyway,
okay, you need to come for fashion lessons.
Well, what's all this paraphernalia here?
Well, it turns out one of our followers, or one of the people that actually watch us on Facebook, I think last week we had about 20,000 or 25,000 views. Mm-hmm. So one of the viewers was
so one out of 25,000.
Yeah. Well,
tiny minority.
Who thinks like you?
Start. We enjoy tea, Kenyan tea, and I think the only requirement was that they would supply, pleasant pastry, and I should have Kericho tea again. So I'm indulging them. It looks lovely, and Rufaro was kind enough to decorate, and I'm looking forward to it.
So you're having tea and cake. This sounds very bougie to me. And, and this particular viewer, was she East African by any chance? Anyway, Rufaro, what are you and I having?
Oh, what's going on over here?
Well, let me come in here. I'm particularly glad that you're not having raw eggs this time around. So,
well, we seem to have survived last week's cocktail quite well. No issues.
I must say the next morning was
eggs
tough.
are
raw
quite
eggs.
safe.
Raw eggs.
Yes.
No, but the next morning was tough. I must admit. I'm not sure I'm doing that whiskey sour thing again. Anyway, what are we having today?
As always, what's happening on this table is much more interesting than what's happening on that table. Today we're drinking another Bordeaux blend, the Merlust Rubicon. It's phenomenal. I think George probably can speak to it more eloquently than I.
This is one of South Africa's more special blends. You might not know this, but I prefer blends any day, both whiskey and wine. But South Africa has a few very special red wine blends. Among them, we count the R&R Classique, we count the Chocolate Block, and the Merlust Rubicon. Not very mainstream, but something that I definitely recommend that anybody tries. Very creamy, very rich on the nose. For me, it's got hints of chocolate. Am I starting to sound bougie? Anyway, I think suffice to say that it's something that you should try if you haven't. I think it's a very pleasant experience.
Yeah, and today we have a decanter. Let it breathe and express itself a bit more. So it's delightful.
Yeah.
Well, there are no raw eggs, so
You should
I'm
try
sure it is.
Should try sometime. Your demeanor might actually improve.
Raw eggs.
You're a bodybuilder. You know all about raw eggs
Yeah, but not in
drinks.
in alcohol.
Well, you don't know much about alcohol. Anyway, gentlemen, tore through the news. A few interesting things have happened this week. One of them is we learned about a body called the Consumer Protection Commission. I hadn't heard about it before. I don't know if any of you had. But they came through and said that they were looking at pricing in the market, and anybody they thought was profiteering was at risk of losing their license.
What is profiteering anyway?
I have no idea.
Good question. I mean, maybe some of the viewers could maybe type in the comments section, depending on what platform you're watching us. What do you think profiteering is? But who are they? Who's the CPC?
Well, it turns out it's a body that was formed in 2019, so it's barely 2 years old, and they go around and look at businesses and pick the ones that are profiteering. But talking to our lawyer friends, there is no law against profiteering.
What is profiteering? Because
Well,
if
it
you're in the
turns
private
out-
sector, you're in the business of making a profit, right?
Okay. We must accept. You guys are extreme capitalists. I think I'm a centrist.
Are you a
And
capitalist or communist?
I think I'm
Like
a
on that
centrist.
spectrum, where are you?
I'm in the middle.
Are you?
But I think profiteering probably exists in the vocab on the left.
No, there's no probably
and
about it. It definitely exists on the left. You will
and
never
there's-
hear any free market capitalists talk about profiteering.
And there's nobody on this show who's going to speak for that side of the aisle.
But I've got a particular case. I don't know whether you would term it profiteering or not. Maize is going for, I think it was 32,000, and if you use the auction rate, that will give it.
You're talking about the GMB
roundabout.
price, which is
GMB,
38,000.
yeah,
38,000.
So GMB is buying a 32,000 bond. Yeah?
It's buying at 32,000,
Which is
bond,
around
and from my farmer
$350,
friends,
$400, yeah?
It will cost you about $150 or $100. Would you term that profiteering?
On
Our
whose part?
farmers profiteering.
Yeah, but which rate are you using?
Well, the government rate, of course.
No, I'm not going down this rabbit hole.
No, it's not a rabbit hole. I mean, so how are you going to determine whether or not somebody is profiteering?
I think it's arbitrary. I think, and that's my first problem with it. If you don't define what profiteering is clearly, then anybody can wake up and decide that a particular price increase is profiteering, right? And the reason why such an expression doesn't exist in the world of free market capitalism is because if Tinashe sets up a business and he's making 200% margins, other players in that market are going to see that, find it lucrative, and enter the market, undercut him until competition in the market reduces those margins to levels that are sustainable over the long term. So in the end, the consumer gets the best price possible.
Well.
So the idea that I can set up a business and price in a way that and impose a price on the market, right, where I'm making a super profit indefinitely, it doesn't make any sense to me.
Except, and I thought you'd come in here, Tinashe, with your economics buzzword bingo, and talk about structural inefficiencies.
Why would I talk about structural inefficiencies when Rufaro has lucidly and articulated the market that there are no structural inefficiencies? As long as you have an open market. Were you listening to what Rufaro was saying?
But that's
as long as
but
you have an open market, then it means that players will come in.
But you always
and
come in and
address-
remind us that it's not a perfect market. There are structural inefficiencies and there are structural rigidities. Which we have in
Tinashe
this
actually
country.
uttered those words. This is Tinashe.
Yes.
I'm amazed.
He always comes in and reminds us that things can't work according to the textbook.
No, that's definitely
Okay, well,
not.
let me paraphrase the argument you always put through.
No, that's not my argument.
Okay, you can
Make
comment once.
make your own argument.
You can,
George,
you can
but that's
comment
certainly
after,
not my
You
argument.
don't even know what I'm going to say. You can comment after. I
Well,
say
you
it.
started on a very bad footing.
Well, let me finish.
You have me agreeing with Tinashe. But anyway, carry on.
Look, you do have, and I experienced this in my other life as a farmer. You've got a scenario right now where it's winter, so our horticultural production is down. There are bans on importation of certain horticultural produce, and yet that imported horticultural produce finds its way onto our shelves. And if you look at the pricing of that horticultural produce on our supermarket shelves, it makes no sense. It's 4 or 5 times what that stuff would cost if it was being produced locally, or what it would cost in its source market, which is largely South Africa. The only thing that makes sense is there's so many middlemen or so many people involved in getting that pepper or pear or apple into the country that all want a piece of the cake that is resulting in crazy pricing to the end consumer in the end. Now you can comment.
I'm not so sure I get your point.
And also, you prefaced your argument with some rules that make me suspect you're not describing a free market.
And is Zimbabwe a free market? Do those rules not apply in this country?
Yeah, but okay. So here's the thing. If which is the only bit of SI 127 that made sense to me is if you are getting preferential allocation of currency at 85, then I think the state should have a say in how you price
Are you
whatever.
saying this? Is this coming from
Yes.
from Rivara?
The state should have a say in how you price whatever you import and sell because they have given you a subsidy, right? That's not a free market phenomenon, right? Already. So we're not talking about. So you can talk about. I think profiteering is relevant when you talk about merchants who are getting some sort of subsidy, right? They have an obligation to make good on their benefactor in terms of the subsidy, right? But in a free market, right? If I have to source all my raw materials in a free market, then I should be able to price my final product whichever way I like.
But this is more or less what Uncle JPM said when he moderated SI 127. He said, look, if you get your currency on auction, I'm coming after you. If you don't...
Okay, maybe let me give perspective because I think you guys have gone down a rabbit hole. And
I think we're in Wonderland, yeah. I mean, I think you and I have swapped places completely.
No, we are in Wonderland. So let's come back to reality. I think let's be very clear. So this idea of calling it a free market, I would not necessarily call it a free market.
But you did.
I would call it a market. And what tends to happen is that there will be buyers and sellers. Just because there are no buyers and sellers in the official market does not mean that there are no buyers and sellers in the unofficial market. So if you officially set a price, as the state is intending on doing through...
Well, they didn't say that.
Well, the minute you start talking about profiteering, it means in your head you have a particular price.
Profiteering is a euphemism for price control. From my perspective.
But you just said it was okay for them to do it.
Oh.
You said if I get my money from them, then they can tell me what to price it at.
Rufara, I think we have a resident communist here. George, would you like to come out?
No. He said that. He said if you get your money on auction, then
well, if it's not a free market, you're not getting it from a free market.
Okay, so let's be clear. Gentlemen, let's be clear. The auction is not a free market. No, is it a market? Let's be very clear. Because there is no willing buyer. There's a willing buyer, but there's no willing seller. So it's not a market.
So what's your point?
It's a subsidy and it's rationing of currency.
So
it's not a market. So let's not talk about the auction market.
If you've benefited from this subsidy, and then you go and use crazy pricing, can you not be accused of profiteering? And should your license not be taken away?
You should not be accused of anything. It's inevitable that there will be arbitrage.
So it's okay?
It is okay because an arbitrage
So we
must
must leave
go
it
away.
alone.
An arbitrage must go away. The minute you create an arbitrage where somebody can make up to 60 or 70% in arbitrage profits, what do you expect them to do? You expect them to be pious.
so we
These
must
are
leave
not
it-
priests. We're not in heaven.
So we must leave it the way it is?
No,
We must do nothing?
we must take away the auction because the auction is not a market.
So you reckon the source of the profiteering is the auction?
There is, well, first of all, I don't agree with the word profiteering. If somebody takes advantage of an arbitrage opportunity,
But is it?
You know,
but,
yeah,
is it, but, is
and-
it, but is it only the auction?
You know,
or is it the
St.
case-
Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, a lot of people have gone into great detail on what you term speculative or profiteering.
I didn't say speculative.
And they have made it very clear that it is not. If you find an opportunity and you take one product from one end of the market and you take it to another, it is not profiteering and it's nothing immoral. So if the government goes out of the way and gives people money at subsidized rate,
Okay, Tinashe.
we are not in heaven. Do not
but-
expect
but-
those
but
people
is it
to
just-
behave as if they're in
But
heaven.
Tinashe, is it just
We're
the
not
auction?
in heaven.
Is it just the auction, right? So, okay, you point to the auction. But what about in my example of apples coming from South Africa, where import permits are regulated?
So how is it a free market?
And I've got a cousin.
How-
Nobody said it's a free market. It's not.
So why are we using free market standards for markets that aren't free?
And that's why the Consumer Protection Council is saying we're going to come after you.
You see, it's. I think what's happening here is, you create a policy that is bad, right? And then you wake up the next day and you have all these unintended consequences, and you realize, oh, okay, I didn't want this to happen when I issued the policy, but instead of reversing the initial policy that has issues, you come up with new policy to try and deal with some of the unintended consequences. And this is what's
That's
happening.
exactly
You're
what
saying,
Microsoft does
we're giving.
when they issue software that doesn't work properly.
I think that's a bad
It's a
analogy.
voluntary association. It's a voluntary competitive association with whichever product you have in the world. And the mistake you're making with your example is you must first be very clear. Are we talking about a market? And a market is defined by one little thing: voluntary buyer and seller meeting. Does not need to be free. But if you do not have a voluntary buyer and a voluntary seller exchanging, it is not a market, let alone a free market. It's not a market.
But it's what we have.
We are saying we do not have a market.
Yes.
Right. So if you do not have a market, perhaps that is what we must address. Not this idea of profiteering and all these structural inefficiencies, as you term. There are no structural inefficiencies if the fundamental is that we do not have markets in Zimbabwe.
It's like being sick, right? And presenting with symptoms. Okay, you can deal with the symptoms, or you can deal with the underlying illness, right? And I think that profiteering is a symptom of a policy framework that runs away or is divergent from free markets, right? So we have a fixed exchange rate, or a controlled exchange rate, and people are able to access money at 85, and then enter a market where they can price differently in a way that the state doesn't like, right? And this is what they're trying to address by talking about dealing with profiteering. So profiteering is a symptom, but the core issue, the problem, is that you have a broken exchange market for currency.
It's not even an exchange market. Let's call it for what it is. It's not. A market is the free voluntary exchange by a buyer and a seller. We do not have that.
Okay, we better move on before you say those two words.
That we've banned.
Yes, we're not saying those two words on this show. Moving on.
Apologies.
Elsewhere in the news, this week we had some trade statistics coming out from Zimstat, which suggests that our trade deficit, while it has decreased month by month from the beginning of the year until May, has actually increased against last year. I know, Tinashe, you're just dying to spit out some figures. So I'll indulge you for a second.
Okay, I think for the first 5 months of the year, we exported 2 billion worth of goods and we imported 2.4 billion worth of goods. So
these are US dollars. So
US dollars, trade deficit of 400 million.
So this is something that I always ask, right? We have a trade deficit, but nobody's lending to us. You're not going to go to the World Bank and get credit. You probably can't even get a South African supplier to give you credit at the moment because you probably owe them from the legacy debt. So how was this 400 million paid for? The difference between the two and the 2.4.
Yeah, which is why I think that the whole discussion about trade deficits or surpluses in a Zimbabwean context is meaningless because every import in this country is funded. So because the government isn't able to raise money on global capital markets, most individuals...
So nobody's able to raise money on
and corporates can't buy on credit from jurisdictions outside the country. So every import that comes in is funded. So what if we report a deficit? What that fundamentally is an accounting problem where we're saying, because imports come through the borders and are recorded, right? And we've got a very strict exchange control regime, so all exports are recorded. If you if you have a relative in the diaspora, okay, and they pay for an import for your relative,
a Honda Fit for me.
Yeah, when that vehicle reaches the border, it's recorded as an import, okay, and the relative in the diaspora pays the duties and taxes on that. So on the national accounts, let's say it's a $10,000 car, right? In the national accounts, we have an import of 10,000, but it doesn't have a corresponding export, right? Because it was paid for offshore. But in reality, the corresponding export is a diaspora receipt. So it's missing from the national accounts. We don't record it. So when you look at it superficially, it looks like we have a deficit, but we don't.
I'm not so sure what your argument is.
So what I'm saying is it's irrelevant. I don't understand why anybody pays attention to trade deficits or surpluses.
No,
because
he wants to get into a technical discussion on trade or current account deficit. But
No. That's not the argument. He's explaining why we have a deficit. So it's actually good that we get these numbers. And what is important for us is to actually dissect the numbers and say, what does it mean? And what you've just given us is one explanation on why that deficit is there. So when you look at those numbers and you see the deficit, then you're saying, well,
it's not a problem.
It's not a well, that we know, but we're trying to explain this gap because money went out and money came in. So that deficit is real, right? That official deficit is real. The unofficial one could be bigger or not, but that official deficit is real. And
but we can't have a real deficit because we are unable to borrow.
No.
Well,
what you're now doing
is trying to say, yes, technically we have a deficit, but what's more important is to understand.
We can explain it away.
What the two sides mean: the exports and the imports. What the numbers mean.
We can explain it away and say, one, we have remittances that are coming in the form of goods in the official market, especially cars, it could be machinery, it could be
even
whatever.
Groceries.
Even groceries, whatever it is. But a lot of groceries are not official. So these are official numbers. So I suspect a lot of our cars are coming in officially. And it could be remittances coming in the form of goods, that's one. It could also be how goods that are smuggled outside. So the money gets outside and is not recorded as an export. So we already know, I mean, the central bank itself has come out very strongly and has said that we have $100 million worth of gold smuggling that gets out. So you get products that are being exported but are being smuggled outside.
So smuggling is the export.
They're being exported.
Yeah, it's illicit, but it's still exported.
Officially, it's not recorded.
Yes.
But what you only see is the import. So the import could be fuel. So a good is smuggled out and it's sold in the international markets, but in return, the same individuals then import fuel. So
why don't we ask, how did you pay for the fuel?
Why would you?
because surely we want to know
Free funds.
as a state.
This country is very, very clear about free funds.
Yeah, but
if
I
I
must have a burden to prove that they're free.
well, there was an account, an international account, and the money was transferred from that international account. Why would you have a problem with it?
Okay, so anyway, so you talk about
And what would the cost be of trying to figure out how every dollar of import is funded?
Yeah.
I'll tell you.
And why would you worry?
In
Why would
my
you
family's little business, we've been importing small amounts, and the amount of trouble we go to explaining to Zimra how things are being paid for and so on. I naturally imagine they do this to bigger importers. But anyway,
perhaps they don't like you.
Zimra is not interested. It's more about the RBZ will be the one that's interested in illicit flows. So why would Zimra be concerned that you've imported? As long as as long as you're paying all your duties. As long as you're paying all your duties, Zimra doesn't care really.
They actually often ask us for
proof of funds.
payment. But anyway, so you said one potential source of the explanation of the deficit is undocumented diaspora remittances. You said another one is smuggling.
Well, it's not undocumented. It's documented, right?
Well,
It doesn't have a
the funding side is not
the funding
documented.
hasn't been documented.
It doesn't have a corresponding export, just an import.
Okay, let's not get too technical.
Pedantic.
Maybe you should just go back to ice cream and mustard colored pants. Your mood is better when you're wearing those. Okay. Then you said the second one is smuggling. What else should we be looking at?
Credit terms, which is also real, that there is a bit of lending, international lending, against our big exports. So
some of our trade partners.
Some of our trade partners will be offering credit terms.
Okay. What about under invoicing?
I do not think it's a big one, but yes, you could have a bit of that.
Well, why don't you think that's a big one?
Do you think the Zimra guy who's inspecting a container of chilies or peas or honey has any idea what it should have been exported for?
Okay, so
or what should be on the CD1 for?
Okay, so under invoicing, and not to be too technical, but to me, the way I look at it is
under invoicing is a bad term. I don't like
it happens with both.
Transfer
exports.
pricing is what we're talking about, right?
What?
No. It's two things.
Those are two different things.
Those are two different things, and that's why I said I don't think it's something that we should be worried about, because I will assume that if there are bad characters in the market, they're in both markets, importers and exporters, and it cancels out the invoicing. But transfer pricing, I agree. But transfer pricing would come in if we had a trade surplus.
Okay, just unpack for me for a minute. Sorry. What's the difference between under invoicing and transfer pricing? I thought they were the same thing.
Under invoicing is a subset of transfer pricing.
Okay, so they are the same thing.
Okay. As I often say, it's like herding chickens. Anyway, moving on.
Well, let me tell you where I differ. Why I would take it apart and look at it as two different things. Under invoicing, you're saying that you sold an international good for $100, but it actually, costs, well, you actually sold it for $150. But on the other end, I could do equally the same when I'm importing.
No. How is it different from transfer pricing? Because to me, that's transfer pricing.
Because transfer pricing. No.
We're going down a rabbit hole. Look, I think
let's clarify what transfer pricing is.
I don't think it really matters. The point is, you sent an invoice out there, and you received less money than perhaps you should have for whatever mechanics you've used.
But importers are doing the same.
Yes, and you've made your point.
But transfer pricing, it's only one way.
But you've made your point.
You can do it both ways.
Transfer pricing.
I can import something for $100 and record that I paid $150 for it, and I'm still transfer pricing.
The only thing about transfer pricing is this whole universe, and now you're forcing me to become an accountant again. It's this whole universe of things you can do.
You've always been an accountant.
To determine
you will always be an accountant.
Where your profit shows up in a transaction. It's not, the word transfer pricing has been made dirty, but it's not necessarily a dirty thing. It's just a practice.
It is dirty to the extent that you evade taxes in one jurisdiction in favor of.
It can be dirty. The thing is, whenever you're selling, when you're doing a trade between related parties, you can always decide where you want the profit to show. And in fact, it's an established tax practice and tax law practice to accept that a taxpayer has the prerogative to arrange his affairs in a manner that minimizes his tax.
Yes, tax avoidance.
As long as it's legal. So you can use tax transfer pricing to do that. But I don't think that's a rabbit hole we want to go down. But the point is, so there's under-invoicing, but there's also this practice of group companies or parts of international companies using the invoicing process to have their profits show up in lower tax jurisdictions. So, do you know our biggest export destination for tobacco is South Africa? Do you really think our tobacco gets smoked in South Africa?
Of course not.
No,
It goes to China.
And other places.
Absolutely.
Most of it to China.
But I bet you, if you look at those invoices, the Zimbabwean tobacco merchants are exporting to related parties in South Africa.
Yeah.
And those related parties re-export that tobacco. And you will probably find that a certain amount of profit shows up in South Africa. The same thing where one of our biggest export destinations of gold is Dubai. How much gold can Dubai possibly
Can I come in? And this is where I don't have a problem with transfer pricing, but I have a problem with under-invoicing. Because the explanation you've just given, and thanks for that, that was extremely articulate. And to me, that's transfer pricing.
So tax brings out the accountant in you.
Yeah, it does. But under-invoicing is where you literally sell a good with one price, but you recognize it in another price. That is illegal. Would you not agree?
Okay, we're getting into a technical definition, a technical discussion of
where I literally, there are two prices. I invoiced in one price, and then for Zimra and for all the other purposes, I show another price. That is not transfer pricing.
Fair enough. Well, it is transfer pricing, but it's illicit transfer pricing. Fair enough.
Okay.
I think this is a good moment for us to pause and pay the rent. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back. I think that was quite an interesting discussion on transfer pricing, under invoicing, etc. Point is, we've got a trade deficit, which perhaps doesn't mean that we've actually spent money we don't have. Probably means there's a problem with how we're accounting for the money we have. Something else in the news this week was Zimra crowing about how it had outperformed its targets. This resonates with our discussion a few weeks ago where Mtuli told us that he's got a budget surplus. And yet again, I know you're bursting to give us facts and figures, Tinashe. What are the numbers?
Okay. Zimra for the second quarter, they collected $106 billion. ZWL. And for the first quarter, I think they collected for the first two quarters, they've collected 195.
Okay, so they collected 89.
Yeah,
also in the first quarter.
In the first quarter, yeah. So that's how much they've collected, which is I think 13% ahead of their budgeted collections, and way ahead of inflation. I think what's very interesting and
so Zimra is outperforming inflation.
It is outperforming inflation, and there are two or three line items that are really outperforming inflation. Do
you know which ones they are?
Corporates, so corporate tax, that's way outperforming inflation.
So maybe companies are profiteering, yeah? And
compared to last
companies
year.
Definitely aren't profiteering. What's simply happening there is because of the lockdown, a lot and the significant slowdown in traffic across the border by individuals on buses, you find a lot of products that would come in that way illicitly, is now coming through formal channels and is being sold through formal retailers who pay VAT and other taxes. So
another one would be mining royalties. They also way outperforming, I think 400% above inflation, the collections on royalties. And then it's other taxes. That's also
What are other taxes?
I think that includes the transfer tax, the
2%.
The 2% electronic tax.
So
the 2% now contributes about 8% of our taxes, so it's quite significant.
So, it's interesting. I mean, you argue that it's not because corporates are profiteering, but is this not?
Look,
I haven't even asked my question.
Yeah. Before we continue to allow this man to use the word profiteering, you need to explain to us what you think it means and why it has any meaning at all. Because in my vocabulary, it's a dirty word.
I refuse to answer that question.
I'm
You're quite right. You're quite right, Trevor.
What is profiteering?
I'm the one asking the questions here. I'm not answering the
Corporates,
question.
businesses are in the business of making money, of making profit. So when you say profiteering,
This might be a reincarnation of Chavez. If you're not careful.
Okay, but anyway, my real question is, so does this not suggest that either companies are doing a lot better than we think for whatever reason, or B, inflation is not what we're measuring it at?
B.
yeah, well, I don't completely agree with Tinashe. I think that one of the things that is admirable about Zimbabwe is that our economy is structured in a way where the state actually is able to raise significantly more as a percentage of GDP than a similarly sized economy like Zambia. So I don't know whether you remember this, but during the GNU and the US dollar era, we collected about $4 billion a year in taxes. And this was similar to what Zambia was collecting. Although Zambia had a much bigger economy. So I think structurally our country is in a place where the formal sector functions well, and the state
Really?
Yeah, it does. The corporate sector, not the government bureaucracy, the formal sector functions really well, and it makes a meaningful contribution to the fiscus in taxes.
Or Zimra is just more ruthless than
No,
Maybe I can come in there with a slight disagreement with your statements. One of which is, before we decommissioned the US dollar and we moved into Zim dollar, Zimra was actually owed close to $4 or $5 billion by taxpayers, right? So it's not necessarily true that we are performing or better than OECD countries.
No, well, we can't compare ourselves to OECD.
Come now.
No. What that does is we look
OECD
over
are the
time.
richest
They're the
countries in the
richest
world.
countries, right? But what it does is to put into perspective what he's saying.
I was comparing us to
Right.
Zambia.
I mean, how do we go from Zambia to OECD?
Okay, so first of all, OECD defines what we think is the standard, right?
What do you think is the standard?
Yeah, well, why
tax
are we getting
purposes.
standards from the OECD? We're so different.
Because that tells us that you have a big enough tax base, and that tax base is actually paying its tax,
No, I think,
right? And that's where we need to start.
I
then from there, we
You
then
are
analyze.
comparing
No, I think there are too many variables. We're so different.
$20 billion economy to the average size of an OECD economy is in trillions. I mean, like, this is chalk and cheese.
Have you guys never heard of proportions?
No.
I mean, honestly,
No.
I have no idea.
No, I think you should just go back to funny colored pants.
No, I'm actually quite.
You're actually a lot
I'm
more
actually quite
reasonable.
disappointed.
You're actually a lot more reasonable when you're
No,
actually.
I'm actually quite disappointed. And I'm telling you that every economist, every tax economist, that is what they use. That's the standard that they use.
That doesn't mean it's right.
And, well, first of all, it defines what our target
Yes,
should
that's
be.
a logical fallacy
Right.
called argumentum ad populum. But anyway, carry on.
Well, no, it's not.
No.
It's not. It's
Tinashe,
not even a
this-
fallacy.
Tinashe,
It's not a fallacy.
Tinashe,
It's
if-
not a
if-
fallacy. Just because you call it a fallacy
if you use
doesn't mean
proportions-
it's a...
If you use proportions, you are going to ask, you're going to tell Strive's gardener that he's perfectly unreasonable for spending a much bigger proportion of his salary on food than Strive.
In economics, actually, we look at it's actually one important thing that we actually discuss, and we look at the marginal propensity to consume.
You should stop breaking that.
A gardener's marginal propensity to consume is much higher than his master.
I think this is where we move on.
I'm deeply
I agree with
surprised.
George. I agree with George.
I'm actually deeply
we can
surprised.
go into proportionality in detail in another episode because I think this will be a fascinating conversation.
I think
but
so.
for now,
I'm actually
we will struggle
quite
to stop laughing.
surprised. I'm quite surprised. I'm actually deeply surprised that you guys don't know this elementary stuff. I'm actually quite surprised.
Okay, let's move on swiftly.
Marginal,
Anyway,
the
Before
marginal
this
tax rate.
conversation gets
Anyway,
taken over by
We've never-
by
no,
laughter.
no.
We're shutting this down. We're shutting this down.
Tinashe,
Yeah.
right. So Zimmer's done phenomenally well, according to the reports. Where did the money go?
Oh, into our budget surplus, right? So we did this great job of collecting all this money, and we also did another great job of spending less than we collected. So
I don't think that's,
which is why we've reported a $9 billion surplus.
Well, I differ. Part of it is actually going to the auction. So the auction is, a third of the auction is actually funded by tax collections, USD tax collections. So a third of the auction is coming from taxpayers who are paying in US dollars. And so we subsidized, the state has subsidized the importers. So that's where a lot of the money actually in US dollar terms, if you think about it, that's where it's going. And part of it is actually just running treasury. We've got a lot of subsidies. So you may not know this. Zupco is subsidized quite heavily. In fact, the price for Zupco has actually come off in the last quarter. I think they've reduced the price from $100 to 60.
No, I think you're wrong, but anyway.
Well,
It's gone up, but okay, yes.
no, they actually reduced the price.
The point is, there's
There's a heavy
There's a
subsidy.
subsidy, yes.
There's a heavy subsidy, and that's coming from the tax collections. So as far as the government is actually concerned,
GMB is consuming a big chunk.
that will come in. I think we'll start seeing it in the next quarter. We will start seeing those numbers. The GMB subsidies are quite heavy, and we'll start seeing those in the next quarter.
I want to go back to this discussion on auction.
Yeah.
Because you raised an interesting point. So if Zimmer has collected hard currency and sold it on auction, that means they've accounted for it at 85 or a similar such rate.
Yes.
There is no similar such rate at 85.
85. Well, it means at 84 or 85.
Because our,
So that means
our currency is the most stable in the world. It doesn't move. It's at 85.
So that means by most people's reckoning, they've actually exceeded their target by a wider margin than they've reported.
Yeah, because the real rate is at least 135. So they've underreported their collections to the extent that they're reporting them at 85.
Well,
yeah,
I think-
I agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, but not so in real terms. And that's why the proportions have to come in. Because when you look at, during the GNU...
We're not doing
I think
proportion
you
thing.
like being mocked, don't you?
Absolutely. I mean, if I'm right, I'm right. Whether you mock me or not, it doesn't change the fact. If you look at the GNU, our tax collections used to be, as a percentage of GDP, used to be 20%. It went as high as 23%, but it's usually 20%. Right now, what we're collecting as a percentage of GDP in US dollars, it's coming to around 16%. They think it will improve to 17%. So that tells you in real terms what's actually happening. And what I'm saying is, we're being heavily subsidized.
So the economy has shrunk, basically. That's what you're saying?
The economy has actually shrunk in real terms. So although ZIMRA, and that's why I thought that we should go back to first understanding your question, which was whether this was because the economy is growing or the monetary base is growing. And I think what it just tells us...
I think that's your question. Okay, but carry on.
No, when you said AB, I'm just putting
No,
it
carry
in
on, carry
economic
on,
terms.
carry on.
In economic terms. And what it just tells us is that the monetary base is not in tandem with the fiscal, what's happening with the fiscal. And that's why you get these ZIMRA numbers that are phenomenal by any count. They are phenomenal. But it doesn't speak to what's happening in the real economy because they're having to subsidize. So ZIMRA, or taxpayers, are having to subsidize importers. And as you already have spoken to, we're importing 2.4. What if that ZIMRA subsidy was not there for importers? What would have happened in real terms?
Well, people would definitely drink less Merlust.
There you go. So it's phenomenal that ZIMRA is collecting this money, but because of these heavy subsidies, that money is just going down the drain, and it's going into someone's pocket who's going to take advantage of the arbitrage. So they're getting taxpayers' money at 85.
So there is profiteering.
That's
a dirty word. Didn't we just establish that?
Anyway, moving on. Also in the news, civil servants got a 45 to 50% salary increase this week after they got 25% earlier in the year. What does this mean? How much do they now earn? How does this compare with inflation? What kind of state does that put them relative to the rest of the people in the economy?
I think of all sad numbers.
Is this part of what Mthuli is doing with his surplus?
I think of all sad numbers, the saddest number is what our civil servants are being paid. It hasn't kept up with inflation. So you have ZIMRA, whose numbers are way outperforming inflation. And then you look at civil servants, and that's the direct payment that ZIMRA must make, that the government must make, is to ensure that the civil servants earn a livable income. And unfortunately, it has not kept up. So they've increased the price, the income that civil servants are earning, I think from 19,000 on average to about 30,000. But that's still, if you put it in US dollars, that's about $200 US. And that's still way behind what they used to earn before.
But could we afford what they used to earn during the GNU when we were collecting $4 billion a year in taxes? And even if we could afford it then, did it make sense for us to pay that much?
Actually, Rufaro, during the GNU, they earned about $160.
At the beginning?
No, at the end. Their salaries crept up to $400 or $500 after the GNU under Chinamasa. So is this not a realignment to get us back to an affordable position?
Okay, George, don't talk numbers because I think you will get it all wrong.
He's the accountant.
And his numbers are
correct
wrong.
me.
They actually started with Tendai BT at $100.
Yes.
Right? And it went up to as high as $400. This is the average, to around $400.
During BT's time?
During BT's time. And it only crept up to about $500 when Chinamasa came in.
So how are you guys disagreeing?
Okay, so he's disagreeing with when it went up to $400.
When it went up. So
Okay,
the
so-
GNU was actually
but the point is...
But the
But
point...
you
But
get the point.
was that reasonable? Could we, as a small poor country, afford to pay the average civil servant
That's a
$400?
separate debate. And I think...
Yeah, so let's have that. Let's have that.
No. But first, let's answer his question, which I thought was a very important question and that we need to articulate even a little.
I'm not even sure which question you answered.
Okay,
but-
that
carry on.
ZIMRA, that the issue is...
The disconnect
how can
between ZIMRA, what it's collecting, and what we're paying civil servants. Yeah.
And this speaks to the subsidies that ZIMRA is engaged in. That ZIMRA or the government or the policymakers have made a choice that they would rather subsidize the importers, right, at 85 and not pay salaries. That, in simple terms, is what's happening.
They are paying salaries.
I
You're
think
being
you're being
dramatic.
facetious.
Yeah, and disingenuous. Look, so let's go back to my question.
I think maybe you should have some cake or something.
Yeah, your glucose levels might be low. Look, at $400
Have you
a
understood
month.
what I've said?
Yes, we understood what you
And we're
said.
responding.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, you don't have a monopoly on.
Okay. All right.
Right.
Go
So,
ahead.
so my question is that $400 a month, average monthly salary during GNU, did that make sense for where we were given the size of our economy, and what civil servants in similarly sized countries like Zambia, like Malawi, like Mozambique have been paying, even South Africa actually. So were we paying what
we
made
could afford.
sense?
Okay.
And bearing in mind
And
the
then-
size of the civil service.
Okay.
We've got
Is
400,000 civil servants.
is that your argument as well?
No, it's a question. It's not an argument.
No, I got that, but I want to understand George's argument. Are you in tandem with what
It's a
Rufaro is
similar
asking?
point that we're saying that you can't. I think you're being disingenuous by comparing them, say 2016, 2017 to now, without looking at where we were around 2010, 2012.
Okay, so if Zimra, if your collections are growing at a fast rate, at a faster rate than inflation, right? Your collections are growing at an increasing rate than inflation.
Bearing
your
in mind, you
salaries-
sat here a few weeks ago and challenged the official inflation rate.
Well, that's another rabbit hole.
Yeah, whichever rate you're using, we're saying that the collections are way higher than any inflation rate or any metric you can use.
No, we get that. Yeah.
And we're saying salaries are not, and salaries constitute 60% of our collections, right? And salaries are not increasing at a similar rate.
Should they? Is that the case you're making?
No. First, let's understand what is actually happening.
No, I think we understand.
Then we can get into a policy discussion. And what I'm saying is, your collections are increasing at a faster rate.
You don't have to keep saying that. We understood that.
Okay, so
Pretend we're not six today.
how do you account for the difference? Because our surplus is not that much. So how do you account for the difference?
We spent it on other things.
What other things?
Do you increase your domestic stocks?
No,
George, what other things?
But before we engage George's argument,
before we get there, I think George is on the right track. What other things?
Well, you tell us.
No. You tell me, because
I don't know.
You
You're the
laughed
economist.
You laughed. I said we're spending on subsidies, and you said no, we're not spending on
I
subsidies.
didn't say that.
That's exactly what you said. And I said we're spending on subsidies, and the one thing that we're
Okay, let's concede the
subsidizing
point.
heavily is a third of auction. And a third of auction, if you think about it, it's $1.4 billion. That's money going into the auction. And a third of that money is coming from Zimra. That is what we're subsidizing.
Yeah, we didn't disagree with that.
So we're not paying salaries because we're subsidizing.
we are paying
importers.
salaries. We're not paying the kind of salaries you think is ideal. There's a big difference.
No, it's not what I think is a deal. I'm saying if your revenues we're increasing in whichever metric you use, at whatever rate of increase, your revenues are increasing at.
But the
Your salaries should increase at that same revenue.
No.
Oh my gosh! If you are running a business and you ran a brilliant marketing campaign and you doubled your revenues, you double your payroll.
No, I wouldn't.
So why are you using this standard for government?
Because inflation, that's why you have an inflation
But
rate.
we're not talking about
Because
inflation. We're talking about.
If you want to be indifferent, if you want the civil servant to be indifferent, and if you want Zimra to be indifferent, it means that the rate of increase
But why should
must
they
be
be
the same.
Why should they be indifferent? But also, look, a
For
different
you to be indifferent, and I'm not even talking about
a different way to look at it as well, Tinashe, is that the ultimate beneficiary of the subsidized exchange rate is the consumer, because it's gone into cooking oil, it's gone into diesel, it's gone into all these things. The consumer is paying less for his groceries.
You
Who
hope
is the
so.
same civil servant.
No, you hope so. That's not exactly what happens. So what will happen is the money gets
You
to
haven't
the
done
auction.
groceries for a while, have you?
No, remember, I'm the one guy in this who actually knows what's happening
How
on
much
the
is 2
ground.
liters of cooking oil in this country?
So let's
He probably uses olive oil and has no idea how much cooking oil.
what I'm trying to say is, if you look at what's happening with the auction, this is where you have a problem, right? That Zimra will give the auction money, but you do not know what the guy who receives the auction money, what he will do with it. That's the problem, right? Now you're saying you're trying to
You
indirectly.
keep changing your idea of what the
No,
problem
no, but okay. You know what?
No, the problem is
we're
the
going to get
same.
lost in this space. I agree with
problem is the
Tinashe
same.
that subsidies are a bad idea. Okay, I'm a free market capitalist. We shouldn't subsidize anything. We should let the market determine the pricing. But having said that, like this is where I want to challenge Tinashe to say, let's assume hypothetically we weren't subsidizing anything. If the state was collecting more in revenue, why does it necessarily have to pay more in salaries?
Ah, fantastic. Thank you very much.
We've been trying to ask you this for 15 minutes.
No. This is actually
Okay,
a different question, but a very important question. Two things would happen. The first thing is you want a motivated civil servant. There's a reason why you want that. So, for example, your judiciary members, you do not want them to be paid misery salaries, 150, 200.
But we're not talking about the level. We're just saying the state is now collecting more, right? We haven't agreed that they're currently paying a pittance or below
I'm saying
market.
whatever they're collecting, you need to ensure that your civil servants are motivated. Teachers haven't been going to work for a very long time, and you want to create fourth industrial revolution, and it's premised on education. So
But is the problem
haven't been
is the problem
going to
not?
work.
See, so I think you're conflating issues.
Okay,
Is the problem?
the producer's jumping up and down. Maybe let's let him wind up his argument.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is, the first of all is you need a motivated civil servants. So that's number one. Number two, you want to direct a lot of that money. You want to give it back to corporates, because you want corporates to make the decisions. So there's really no reason why you should have 2% tax and all this.
You're so lucky the producer's jumping up and down.
Because you want to give back. If Zimra is collecting as much as it does, you want to give that money back.
Can I have the last word
the
next
producers.
episode?
Okay, next episode will be your turn. Unfortunately, we've got to wind it up here. I'm about to get killed by the producer. Once again, it's been lovely having you with us. And I think it's been a very spirited discussion, which tends to remind one of the famous Oscar Wilde's quotation that the truth is really pure and never simple. Once again, if you find yourself taking us seriously, you really ought to have your head examined. We need to get home before 6:30 curfew.
6 o'clock.
It's 6:30.
Oh, oops.
You get an extra 30 minutes. Trust me, I had an incident with cops recently. We need to get home early. You should too. Have a nice weekend. Stay safe. Be good. If you can't be good at it.